Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
You ever been in a room where everyone is laughing but you're sure the joke's about you? Not because someone told you directly, but because that sinking feeling in your stomach knows the rhythm of humiliation a little too well. That's what every holiday, every birthday, every damn family gathering felt like growing up in our house. My mother, Judith, made sure the spotlight only ever hit one person, my older brother Mark. And the rest of us, or rather just me, were left standing in the dark, clapping like trained seals while she gushed over the golden child's latest bare minimum achievement like he'd discovered fire. So when I got the invitation to her 72nd birthday party, handwritten, floral bordered, sealed in real wax like some Game of Thrones episode, my first instinct was to laugh. Not just because it was over the top and dramatic, which of course it was, but because I knew, deep in my gut, that she was planning something. Judith never hosted anything just for the sake of celebration. She threw performances, not parties, and she always made sure the plot ended with her on top and someone else humiliated just enough to remind them who held the power. I'd been that someone else more times than I could count. Still, I RSVP'd yes, with a smile and clicked send. Because this time, the game was going to end differently. Let me take you back, just briefly. Growing up, our household had clear rules, none of them written down, but all enforced like gospel. Rule number 1. Mark could do no wrong. The time he crashed Dad's Buick into a parked car while drunk? He's under stress, poor thing. The semester he flunked out of college? Boys mature slower, he'll catch up. Meanwhile, when I got a B+ in AP Calculus, it was a full 10-minute lecture on how I lacked focus and probably wouldn't survive in the real world. Judith had a way of spinning reality so hard that it made you question whether the sky was even blue or just some shade she painted to suit the mood. Mark soaked it up, of course. He loved the praise, the attention, the endless pats on the back for accomplishments that wouldn't impress a half-asleep substitute teacher. And while he collected trophies and excuses, I learned early on to do things alone: school, work, taxes, life. I didn't get applause, but I got confident. Quietly. While they mocked me for being too serious, too sensitive, too cold, I was busy building something real, brick by brick. But that kind of resentment, when it simmers long enough, doesn't just sit there. It ferments. It sharpens your edges. A year before the birthday party, I got a phone call from an old neighbor, someone who still lived down the street from our childhood home. She sounded cautious, like she wasn't sure she should be telling me this, but in the end, curiosity and a little guilt pushed her words out. She said she'd seen a man post a foreclosure notice on the gate of the house. Said Judith looked rattled. Said it was probably nothing, but felt I should know. I didn't call Judith. I didn't even call Mark. I drove down, parked half a block away, and walked past the house like I was a stranger. It looked tired. Not just the cracked paint or the sagging porch swing, but the energy. The house had always felt angry, like it could breathe. Now it looked like it had finally exhaled for the first time. But sure enough, on the gate, barely visible under the ivy, was a laminated notice. The address was correct. The lender's name I didn't recognize. But what mattered was the phrase in bold red letters: Notice of Default. That was the moment something shifted in me. For the first time in my life, I saw a crack in her armor. Judith had built her identity around that house, her kingdom, her fortress, her stage. She used to say, "This house will stay in the family, but only in the right hands," which always meant Mark's. I remember one summer evening, I was maybe 15, she said to me point blank, "You'll leave, and you won't come back. You don't belong here." And I believed her. Until now. I did my homework. Quietly. Discreetly. Through contacts from my consulting work, I found a real estate lawyer and asked every question I could think of. I learned that the reverse mortgage Judith had taken out after Dad passed away, a desperate move masked as a smart retirement choice, had ballooned into a mess. She had stopped paying the taxes, missed a key notice, and the loan servicer had started the process to repossess. Now here's the interesting part: because the house had been appraised years ago and no one had updated the title properly, it opened the door for outside investors to make an offer if the foreclosure proceeded. It just had to be structured the right way. So I formed an LLC named after a lake Judith always claimed was beneath her taste and started the paperwork. Step by step. Every form, every email, every dollar accounted for. Mark never knew. Judith never suspected. They lived in the echo chamber they'd built, too busy throwing pity parties about the world being unfair to notice someone had learned how to use the system they took for granted. The final call came in 3 days before her birthday. The title had cleared. The offer had been accepted. The house, my childhood prison, my ghost, was now mine. Legally, quietly, irrevocably mine. And the best part? She still thought she owned it. So when I walked into that birthday party, smiled politely at the guests, kissed her on the cheek, and handed her that expensive bottle of wine she loved but never bought for herself, I wasn't nervous. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad. I was patient. Because Judith always loved a big reveal. She just didn't realize this time the spotlight wasn't going to land on her. Not yet. And I know what you're thinking. Why didn't I just let it go? Why didn't I rise above it, take the high road, show I was better than all of them? But here's the thing. Sometimes the high road is just a longer path to the same dead end. Sometimes, the only way to break free is to turn around and face the ghost, not to forgive it, but to bury it. And Judith? She wasn't ready for what I'd dug up. There's a strange kind of silence that clings to the walls of a house once it's been emptied of hope, a silence that doesn't comfort or soothe, but instead waits, watchful and judgmental, like it remembers every word that was shouted in anger. Every sob muffled by a pillow, every door slammed hard enough to shake the old wooden floors. That's exactly how the house on Sycamore Drive felt the day I stood in the front yard again, not as a daughter, not as a guest, but as someone preparing to buy it out from under the very woman who once told me I didn't belong there. And it wasn't just about revenge, though I'd be lying if I said that wasn't part of it. It was about something deeper, something darker, the long overdue reckoning with a past I had buried but never quite escaped. The house itself hadn't changed much on the outside. The same uneven brick walkway still made you trip if you didn't watch your step. The cracked window in the upstairs bedroom, where I used to write in my journal at night, was still taped over with that ugly silver duct tape Judith insisted was temporary, though it had been that way since 1998. Even the old swing on the porch, though rusted and creaky, still hung from its chains, swaying ever so slightly in the breeze like it had a memory of the laughter that used to echo there. Not mine, of course, but Mark's. Because Judith always insisted he sit out front like the good boy she raised, waving to neighbors and collecting praise like candy. Walking through the front door that day, with a real estate agent who had no idea about the emotional minefield he'd just stepped into, was like stepping into a time capsule designed by someone who didn't understand that time marches forward whether you want it to or not. The faded floral wallpaper in the entryway still clung to the walls like a desperate ex. The grandfather clock, which never worked, still stood in its corner, tall and useless, like it was placed there just for show, just like everything Judith ever did. She had a habit of curating her life for appearances, meticulously arranging furniture and smiles to fool the world into thinking everything was fine, while underneath the veneer, everything was rotting. I didn't touch anything. I let the agent walk ahead, making notes on his clipboard, pointing out resale value and zoning regulations, while I stood in the living room staring at the fireplace, the same one where Judith used to hang 5 stockings every Christmas. One for each family member and one for guests, which always ended up being Mark's latest girlfriend, regardless of how long she lasted. I never had a stocking of my own after I turned 18. She said I was too old for silly traditions, yet Mark, who was 26 at the time, got one with his name embroidered in gold thread. That was Judith in a nutshell, arbitrary affection doled out like favors, not out of love but control. It was in that room, standing in the very spot where she once accused me of being cold and calculating because I dared to question why she co-signed Mark's second mortgage, but refused to help me co-sign for a used car loan, that I decided I wasn't just buying the house, I was reclaiming it. I wasn't interested in owning wood and drywall. I wanted to own the narrative. The story. The damn ghosts. Back then, Judith ruled the house like a tyrant in heels, issuing commandments from her kitchen throne with a cigarette in one hand and a judgment in the other. Her reign was subtle but absolute: praise Mark, ignore Elena, punish disobedience, reward silence. Even my father, a quiet man who died too early and too tired, used to retreat to the garage for hours on end, just to avoid being caught in her daily crossfire of passive aggression. After he passed, it only got worse. Judith morphed from critical to cruel, and she wore her bitterness like perfume, coating every conversation in thinly veiled resentment. It wasn't just the favoritism that hurt, it was the gaslighting, the constant rewriting of history to suit whatever story made her look like the victim. When Mark got caught with a fake ID and the police called, she cried in the kitchen and said it was her fault for not being a better mother. When I got caught crying in the bathroom because she told me I was a disappointment in front of our cousins, she rolled her eyes and said I was manipulating emotions for attention. Every time I tried to stand up for myself, she flipped the script, made it about her pain, her struggle, her loneliness. And God help me, I bought into it for far too long. But not anymore. The foreclosure documents I had seen were no illusion. The financial mess Judith had created wasn't some temporary blip. It was the result of years of entitlement, of bad choices backed by the belief that someone, usually Mark or the government or fate, would bail her out. She had taken out a reverse mortgage after Dad died, drained every penny she could without understanding or caring about the long-term consequences, and then failed to pay the property taxes for nearly 3 years. When the letters started arriving, she did what she always did, ignored them until the problem became someone else's. That someone, this time, was going to be me, just not in the way she expected. I had to move fast. I filed paperwork under my LLC, named it Silver Hollow Properties, a nod to an insult Judith once hurled at me after I graduated college. She said my accomplishments were silver, not gold, shiny but empty. That name, that sting, had stayed with me for years, and now it would be printed on the deed to her precious house. I didn't do it out of spite. Not entirely. I did it because I wanted to make peace with that girl who used to cry herself to sleep in the room with the broken window, the one who swore she'd leave and never come back. I wanted her to know that even if the past couldn't be changed, it could still be rewritten, just enough to end the story on her terms. And as I stood in that house, breathing in the stale air and feeling the weight of every memory pressing down on me like a damp blanket, I realized something that surprised me. I didn't hate her. Not really. What I hated was the version of myself that once needed her approval. The girl who begged for recognition. The woman who waited for an apology that would never come. That version of me had died long ago, quietly, without a funeral. But this new version? She was just getting started. And Judith had no idea what was coming. There is a peculiar kind of electricity that fills the air before a storm, a low hum that presses against your skin and makes every hair on your body stand on end. And that's exactly what the atmosphere felt like inside Judith's over-decorated living room on the day of her 72nd birthday party. The kind of space so densely packed with fake opulence and emotional landmines that you felt winded just walking through it. The chandeliers were real crystal, of course, because Judith would never allow anything in her house to be less than dazzling, and the floral centerpieces looked like they'd been wrestled away from a wedding planner with a superiority complex, while a string quartet, clearly uncomfortable in their tight corner next to the staircase, played Vivaldi like they were being punished for something. The room was full, not with people who genuinely cared for her, but with those who had been guilt, manipulated, or socially obligated into showing up and smiling for the camera that Judith insisted be rolling at all times. She had hired a local videographer to capture the moment, and from the way she kept adjusting her makeup and tilting her chin, it was clear she believed this event to be her Oscar moment, her grand finale. Her proof to the world that she remained a matriarch worth celebrating, worth fearing, worth obeying. I arrived late on purpose, walking through the threshold with deliberate slowness, letting the door creak behind me in a way that forced heads to turn, including hers. Judith was standing near the fireplace, her usual position, wearing a floor-length lavender dress that screamed pageant more than birthday, her neck wrapped in pearls I hadn't seen since the funeral, and her expression was a masterclass in theatrical detachment. She raised an eyebrow at me, barely smiled, and gestured with her wine glass in a way that could have meant, "Hello, how dare you," or "Don't ruin this for me." I smiled back, not the tight, uncomfortable smile I'd worn for decades, but something calm, even warm, the kind of smile that unnerves people because it reveals absolutely nothing. I walked over, handed her a bottle of Barolo from a vintage she used to covet, but always refused to buy for herself, and said, with all the sincerity I could muster, "Happy birthday, Mom." She sniffed the label, gave a nod of forced approval, and moved on to greet someone else, leaving me standing there, unnoticed and unbothered, just another piece of furniture in the shrine she'd built to her ego. Mark was already deep in conversation with a group of family friends, performing the role of dutiful son with the same smugness he'd perfected over a lifetime. His tie was loose in that calculatedly charming way, and his laugh, too loud and too rehearsed, echoed off the vaulted ceilings as if trying to compete with the music. He saw me, of course, gave me the usual half-wave, the kind reserved for people you tolerate but don't trust, and turned back to his audience like nothing had changed. But something big, something irreversible, and they were all about to find out. The party moved along predictably, hors d'oeuvres passed by on silver trays. People made toasts they didn't mean. Judith paraded around like royalty, kissing cheeks and collecting compliments like tips. But just before dessert was served, the quartet fell silent, the room dimmed slightly, and Judith stepped into the center of it all like a seasoned actress taking the stage for her final act. She cleared her throat, tapped her glass with a fork in that delicate way that somehow still demanded total obedience, and said, "If I could have your attention, just for a moment." The crowd quieted immediately, as if they'd rehearsed this pause. Everyone leaned in, wine glasses frozen midair, waiting for her signature blend of sentimentality and self-congratulation. I knew the cadence of her voice before she even began, the soft, rehearsed tremble meant to imply vulnerability, the dramatic pauses to allow for reaction, the subtle tightening of the jaw whenever she was about to deliver something cruel and call it honesty. "I want to thank each and every one of you," she began, her eyes scanning the room like a director, ensuring the lights were pointed exactly where she needed them. "This birthday is special to me not just because of the number, though 72 is nothing to sneeze at, but because it marks a new chapter, a time to reflect on what I've built, and more importantly, who deserves to carry it forward." The room chuckled politely, unsure of where this was headed, but I didn't laugh. I didn't blink. "For years, I've wondered what would become of this family, of this house, of the legacy your father and I worked so hard to build," she continued, her voice growing more firm, more commanding. "And after a great deal of thought, of soul-searching, of painful decisions," she turned to face Mark directly, reached for his hand, and with a smile that made my skin crawl, she declared, "I've made my choice. Only one child has truly earned an inheritance. Only one has shown the character, the loyalty, and the heart to carry this family forward. And that child is Mark." There was a beat of silence. No gasp, no cheer, just a pause heavy enough to break bones. Then someone clapped, maybe out of confusion, maybe out of habit, and others joined in, the clapping hollow, hesitant, like applause at a funeral. Judith stood tall, her smile triumphant, basking in the glow of a decision she thought would solidify her control one final time. And I clapped too. Slowly, deliberately. The sound cutting through the room not like agreement, but like punctuation, the kind that says, "Are you done now?" I rose from my chair, walked toward the fireplace where she stood, still holding Mark's hand like he was 5 years old again, and had just drawn a picture of a horse that looked vaguely like a dog. I didn't speak right away. I took my time, reached into my purse, pulled out a manila envelope, and laid it gently on the table beside her untouched birthday cake. I leaned in, close enough that only she and Mark could hear, and said, "You should read this before you make any more announcements, Mom." Her smile faltered for the first time all evening. Mark frowned, glanced at the envelope like it was ticking. Judith picked it up, opened it with a shaky hand, and began to read. The more she read, the tighter her grip on the paper became. By the time she reached the final page, her face had gone from smug to slack-jawed. She looked up at me, voice thin and high, almost breaking. "What is this?" I didn't blink. I didn't smirk. I just said, calmly, clearly, with the clarity of a woman who had waited her whole life for this moment, that Judith is proof that I bought this house. Escrow closed last Thursday. And starting next month, I'll be raising your rent. There was no applause now. Just silence. Pure, deafening silence, the kind that follows truth. There are certain moments in life when the air itself changes weight, when the molecules around you seem to slow, thickening with anticipation, dread, or some impossible blend of both, and as I stood there in that over-decorated living room, watching my mother's trembling fingers flip through the pages of the document I had prepared for this very moment, I realized that silence, when it finally descends upon a room full of people who thrive on noise, gossip, and performance, can be far more violent than shouting ever could. Judith's mouth moved slightly, like she was trying to form a sentence, a denial, a curse, or a rebuttal, but nothing came out except a dry exhale that sounded far too much like defeat for her liking. Mark, still gripping his wine glass in one hand and a forkful of untouched cake in the other, leaned over Judith's shoulder, scanning the paper as if he might find a loophole. Some kind of misprint or legal error that could undo what had just unfolded in front of 50 or so witnesses, most of whom had now turned their bodies subtly in our direction, trying to appear as if they weren't eavesdropping, while absolutely not missing a single second of the unraveling spectacle. A few people even took cautious steps backward, as if standing too close to Judith during a meltdown might result in collateral damage, and, honestly, I couldn't blame them. I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I stood firm in my heels, back straight, hands calmly folded in front of me, not out of arrogance or theatrical flair, but because I had already rehearsed the scene in my mind so many times over the past 6 months that my body no longer responded to the emotional landmines being scattered across the floor by Judith's gasps, half-formed questions, and inevitable tears. For years, I had allowed her to craft the script, assign the roles, direct the lighting and applause, but today, for the first time in my adult life, the curtain had dropped and she wasn't the one holding the strings anymore, I was. "Explain this," she finally hissed, her voice sharp but hollow, lacking the righteous fury she used to wield like a blade during every argument, every confrontation, every moment where she could control the narrative with nothing more than tone and volume. This isn't possible. This house isn't for sale. This house is mine." Her voice cracked on the last word, and the desperation in her eyes, masked poorly with indignation, revealed what I already knew. She hadn't been paying attention. She hadn't opened the right letters, hadn't noticed the foreclosure signs, hadn't read the small print, because she assumed, as always, that the world would bend to her ignorance. She thought her legacy was untouchable. She never imagined I would have the audacity, or the intelligence, to take back what she had so viciously withheld my entire life. "Actually," I said, my voice even and conversational, as if we were discussing something as mundane as a change in the weather, "the house went into foreclosure 3 months ago. You defaulted on the reverse mortgage, ignored multiple notices, and failed to pay the back taxes for nearly 3 years. The lender took possession, and when it went up for private acquisition, I made an offer through a third-party LLC. The bank accepted. Escrow closed last Thursday. And as of yesterday, this property, including the land it sits on and all structural improvements, is legally owned by Silver Hollow Properties, which, in case you missed the fine print, is owned entirely by me." Judith's mouth opened again, but still no words came out, just a trembling jaw and the kind of wide-eyed disbelief that comes from living too long in a delusion you built yourself. Mark looked from the papers to me, and for the first time in his life, he didn't look smug or self-assured, he looked exposed, like a man who had just realized he'd backed the wrong horse, and I took a small, quiet satisfaction in watching that realization settle into the lines on his forehead. He stepped forward, squinting as if more light might make the truth less real, and said, "You did this behind our backs?" I turned to him, smiling slightly, not in cruelty but in clarity, because I wanted him to hear every word without distraction. No, Mark. I did this in front of your faces. You just weren't paying attention. Same as always. The silence that followed wasn't polite, nor was it stunned. It was thick with realization, with the slow, suffocating awareness that the family they thought they knew had been reshaped under their noses, not by confrontation, but by quiet persistence. A woman nearby, someone I vaguely remembered from childhood barbecues, cleared her throat and asked Judith if she needed to sit down. Judith waved her away, her pride still clinging to the illusion of composure, but her legs betrayed her, and she sank into the nearest chair like her bones had turned to dust. I leaned in one last time, resting the palm of my hand on the table next to her cake, and said, just loud enough for a few people to overhear, starting next month, your new rent will be $1,500 more. Market rate. Standard lease terms. You'll be getting a packet in the mail. She turned her head toward me slowly, her face a portrait of confusion and betrayal, and for a moment, just one moment, I saw the mask slip completely. The carefully constructed version of Judith, the mother, the martyr, the queen of her own tiny kingdom, disappeared, and in her place sat a frightened, aging woman who finally understood she no longer held the throne. Why would you do this to me? She whispered, almost childlike in her confusion, as if she genuinely didn't understand that the last 30 years had consequences. As if cruelty, when repeated often enough, could ever be erased by a few well-timed tears and a holiday card. I didn't answer right away, because there was no single answer that could sum up what she had taken from me over the years. It wasn't about money. It wasn't even about the house. It was about power. About dignity. About the right to exist in a family without having to constantly prove your worth while watching someone else get praised for simply showing up. So instead of delivering a monologue or extracting revenge with some dramatic speech, I simply straightened up, glanced around the room, and said, "You'll figure it out. You always do." I walked away before she could reply, before Mark could protest, before anyone could process what had just happened, and as I stepped out into the cool night air, the breeze hit me in a way that felt different than before, not cleansing, not forgiving, but final. Like a door had closed, and this time, it wasn't going to reopen. And inside, behind that heavy front door, Judith sat surrounded by people who had once clapped at her declarations and laughed at her jokes, now too stunned to say a word, too afraid to ask what came next. Let them wonder. Let them replay it. I had waited a lifetime for that silence. There is a particular kind of stillness that settles in after a battle, not the kind marked by smoke and ash, but the quiet aftermath of emotional war, where victory and guilt sit shoulder to shoulder, neither willing to speak first. Both weighed down by what's been said, what's been done, and what cannot be undone, and as I stood once more at the top of the front steps of the house that had shaped and bruised me in equal measure, key in hand, silence hanging heavy over the porch like an old quilt soaked in rain, I felt that strange stillness press itself against my chest like a hand, not quite sure whether it was comforting or warning me. It was the morning after the party, or, more accurately, the morning after the implosion, and although I hadn't slept more than a few scattered hours, my mind refusing to settle even after the adrenaline had long faded, I knew I had to come back to the house alone, without witnesses or paperwork or explanations, just me and the creaking bones of the place I had once promised myself I'd never step foot in again. But promises made in pain are slippery things, and sometimes you find yourself drawn back to the very ground that hurt you, not to relive it, but to see if the ghosts still live there, if the echoes still sting, or if, by some impossible grace, you've finally become immune to the sound of your own past. The key slid into the lock easily, too easily, like the house itself recognized me, no longer as an intruder, but as something else entirely, not a daughter, not a tenant, but an owner. And as the door swung open, revealing the same narrow foyer lined with crooked picture frames and dusty sconces that had once glowed during Christmas dinners and screamed silently through cold winter arguments, I realized that nothing had really changed in here. And yet everything had. The walls still bore the faint outlines of photographs Judith had removed long ago, erasing the past like it had offended her. The banister still had that one spindle slightly out of place, the one Dad had meant to fix but never did. And the hallway smelled of her perfume, that sharp, artificial floral scent she used too heavily, perhaps to mask the sourness of disappointment that had long seeped into every inch of this structure. I walked through the room slowly, not like a visitor, not like a conqueror, but like someone seeing a place for the first time with eyes unclouded by need. Because that's what it had always been, hadn't it? A place where I had needed something: love, approval, acknowledgement, peace, and where I had been taught, in no uncertain terms, that needing things was dangerous. The living room looked almost the same as the night before, except the cake had been removed and a few chairs had been moved slightly out of line, as though someone had paced through the night, muttering to themselves, trying to rearrange the past by adjusting the furniture. I could picture her here, Judith, still in that ridiculous lavender gown, pacing with a glass of wine and 1,000 unspoken accusations on her tongue, trying to convince herself that it was all a misunderstanding, that her ungrateful daughter had orchestrated some kind of betrayal rather than facing the obvious truth that what happened wasn't a betrayal at all, but a response, a consequence, a conclusion to a play she directed for decades without ever once asking if the other actors wanted to be there. I sat down in the chair across from the fireplace, the same one Dad used to sit in when he pretended to read the paper, but was really just trying to disappear, and let my hands rest in my lap, not clenching, not fidgeting, just resting. The house was quiet, deeply so, and I began to understand that it wasn't just absence that filled the air, but finality. There was no yelling coming down the stairs, no clatter from the kitchen, no muttered criticisms floating between rooms. It was just me and the bones of what had been built and broken here. For a moment, just one, I wondered if I'd gone too far, not because I regretted the purchase, or the reveal, or the silence I had carved out for myself in that crowded room, but because there was a small, persistent voice inside me, shaped like the girl I had once been, that still wanted to believe that fairness wasn't just a myth, that justice didn't have to be sharp. I had not come here to forgive, but standing in that room, I realized I also hadn't come here to gloat. I had come to decide. And deciding, as it turns out, is its own kind of revenge. There was a folder in my bag containing 2 documents. One was a rental contract, drawn up with clear terms and market rates, outlining Judith's new role in this house as a tenant, not a queen. The other was a deed transfer form, one that, if I chose, would begin the process of turning the house over to a trust, neutral and separate from all of us, dissolving the battlefield into something quieter, more anonymous, less mine. I hadn't decided which to submit yet. And maybe I never would. Because sometimes power lies not in action, but in the ability to choose, and knowing that choice was finally, irrevocably mine. Mark hadn't reached out since the party. Not a call, not a message, not even one of those backhanded apologies he used to deliver with a smirk and a wink, as if admitting fault were a game he didn't mind playing as long as the stakes were low. I assumed he was angry, not just at me, but at the system he thought was built in his favor collapsing without warning. The idea that I could, without screaming, without warning, without even asking for approval, completely rearrange the hierarchy he'd benefited from his entire life, must have shaken something in him that no amount of motherly affection could glue back together. Let it. Judith, for her part, had sent a message through her lawyer, professional, clipped, with just enough emotional subtext to let me know she hadn't changed a bit. She wanted to discuss options. She wanted time. She wanted, in her own way, to reassert some version of control. I hadn't responded yet. I wasn't sure if I would. Because after all these years, after all the screaming and silence and waiting and planning, I didn't need anything from her. Not her apology. Not her understanding. Not even her rent. As I stood to leave, one last glance around the house revealed something I hadn't noticed before: a photo still tucked into the edge of the bookshelf, tilted slightly, half obscured by a dusty vase. It was of me and my father, taken on the front porch the summer I turned 9, both of us squinting into the sun, his arm around my shoulders, my hand clutching a melting popsicle. He was smiling. I was too. And I realized in that moment that this house wasn't just haunted by pain, it was haunted by joy too. Not often, not loudly, but enough. Enough to remember that not everything needs to be burned down. Some things just need to be left behind. And as I locked the door behind me, stepping back into the sunlight, the house stood quietly behind me, no longer a threat, no longer a goal, just a structure, full of history, no longer holding me hostage to it. I didn't know what I would do with it. Rent it. Sell it. Leave it empty. That was the thing. For once, it was up to me. And maybe that was the only inheritance I ever really wanted.